Love that second half of that prayer of confession. It's good to sometimes take those confessions, we acknowledge what we don't do in them, but then maybe reverse them and ask that God might do some of the things in us through God's word that we're not doing. On Ash Wednesday, we put ashes on your head or your hand, and we say, from dust you came, and to dust you shall return. Those are the words that begin the Lenten journey. We remind each other of our mortality. And so begins this journey from any spiritual death we're experiencing into spiritual life. That's what one of the ways we can look at this Lenten journey. And we've been looking at scriptures where there's been a tangible, a real death in the Bible. And then that individual has been brought back to life, has been resurrected. And we, this week and the last 2 weeks, have been looking at 3 Old Testament stories. One that had to do with Elijah, one that had to do with Elisha, and today, this story has to do with Elisha. The first 2 had to do with the raising of a child who died. Today revolves around the death of the prophet Elisha. And so with this background in mind, I invite you to listen or follow along in your pew Bible, 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 14 through 21. Now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, King Joash of Israel went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Elisha said to him, "Take a bow and arrow." So he took a bow and arrow. Then he said to the king of Israel, "Draw the bow," and he drew it. Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. Then he said, "Open the window eastward." And he opened it. Elisha said, "Shoot." And he shot. Then he said, "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. For you shall fight the Arameans in Aphek until you have made an end of them." He continued, "Take the arrows," and he took them. He said to the king of Israel, "Strike the ground with them." He struck 3 times and stopped. Then the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Aram until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Aram only 3 times. So Elijah died, and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. As a man was being buried, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown in the grave of Elijah. As soon as the man touched the bones of Elijah, he came to life and stood on his feet. The word of the Lord. When my father, James J. Perry, died in 2003, my wife Kate and I wanted to do our best to begin teaching our oldest 2 children about death in a way to avoid it or protect them from it too much. At that time, Hunter and Hannah were 5 and 4, and they came to the memorial service, and then they came out to the graveyard, and we had the committal service at the site of the grave. And then we kept the kids around and stuck around for when the folks who worked in the graveyard began to dig the hole for his urn. And he was cremated, and so it was one of those little brass boxes. And so as they were digging, the kids curiously looked in. And then once they were done digging, we brought them over to the hole, and we had them touch and hold Pop. They called him Pop's urn. And then they participated in reaching down into that hole and putting that urn in the hole. And we even took some dirt, and the kids put dirt on top of the urn. And there were a few questions at that age. Hannah and Hunter were like, how did Pop fit into that small little box there? How did that work? And at that age, we did tread lightly over the whole theme of cremation and explained what we could and waited on some things until they were a bit older. But there was something so life-giving in that moment where we were grieving the death of my grandfather and a great-grandfather. There was something so life-giving about having our children there. A hole being dug, holding a heavy brass box, touching the dirt, reaching into a hole in the ground. If you think about it, even though we might consider that a very adult moment, aren't those things that kids do in playgrounds or in the backyard all the time? They get into the dirt, they dig around, they touch things, they lift heavy things, they move things. A lot of those actions are what they're used to. And so in this very serious thing where we're trying to teach them about life and death, isn't it good that they touch the physicalness of this experience around death so that it might become real to them and tangible in a healthy way? Our scripture today has lots of physicalness to it, both the one that Matt read to our children. Wow, that had a lot of physicalness in it. Touching of the eyes, spitting into the dirt, making mud. The physicalness of that was beautiful. But there's a lot of physicalness in our story with Elisha and Joash. And Elisha has done a lot of miracles, but he also has had a very political role. He has been a right-hand prophet to kings, even bad kings, who haven't done what the Lord has wanted them to do. And this king Joash is terrified that he is losing Elisha from his right hand, that he is dying. And what does Elisha do, even as he is on his deathbed? He says, get a bow and arrow. And go ahead and shoot that out the east window. And that arrow flying means that the Lord will have victory over your enemies. And then take those arrows and slam them into the ground. And even though Elisha was angry that he didn't do it enough, it still was a very physical act in the midst of this grief. But the most important physical act in that scene, I think, is when Joash is about to fire that arrow out the window. What does Elisha do? He touches his hand before he fires that arrow. And what is that touch? It's a touch of blessing. You are not alone in what is to come. The Lord, your God, will be with you. I know I have been a voice for this with you, but I touch you and bless you in the midst of all that you are about to experience. And then, of course, we get this somewhat bizarre scene well after Elisha has died and a man is being buried. And those who are burying the man toss the body in when they see warring troops coming. And the man touches the body of Elisha and springs to life. This power of touch in the midst of death and life. Most of you know I'm adopted. My birth mother is alive. But my parents who raised me, my dad died in 2005, and my mom who raised me died in 2013. And I was able to be with them in the hospital both times when they died. I was actually with them when they took their last breath. And one of the things I think about from that time is the importance of touch. That I got to touch them in a way that I hadn't probably touched them since I was a little child. This was past the time of words. Before death, though, where I got to touch their face and kiss their forehead before the dying moment and after the dying moment. With my dad, it was a gentle touch and a gentle kiss, almost thanking him for his gentleness. And with my mom, it was a touch and a kiss that said, "Mom, you don't have to fight anymore. Peace is coming." This intimacy that I had with them, that they probably had with me when I was an infant or a small child, and they touched my face. And when I was able to do that as they were dying and after they took their last breath, in a strange way, even though I was deeply grieving, I felt deeply alive in that moment. And a lot of that was the power of touch. Do you know that touch is pervasive in the Bible? If you really start reading with touch in mind, it is all over the place. From the very beginning, when an animal is sacrificed, or people are dealing with a human corpse, there is a whole process of purification that goes on in the midst of touching something that has been killed, like an animal for sacrifice, or someone who has died. Touch is such an integral part of ritual that we see all over scriptures. One example, the seraphs, or even God touch Isaiah and Jeremiah, respectively, right before they are called into their ministry as prophet. In the Presbyterian Church, we're a little hesitant with touch. Yeah, we do the peace of Christ, but we still have it in our liturgy. Today, after worship, we're going to have a congregational meeting to elect ruling elders and deacons. And in the process of them being called to ministry, when we ordain them, we touch them. Elders and deacons from the past come and touch them and lay hands on them, passing on God's call in a very physical way. As we heard, Jesus touched and healed people, and occasionally people knew Jesus' power, and so they touched Jesus. And we've heard for the last 2 weeks stories about children that died. And the first move that a parent makes when this child dies is they go to the bed of the prophet, because the prophet's not around, and they lay the child in the bed because they hope touching something that has touched someone who is holy will bring life. And in the story we read last week, they even try it with a stick the prophet carried. They tried laying it on the face of the child. Maybe this will bring the child back to life. But it finally took the prophet in a very physical way, touching the child and praying to God for life to emerge. I know it seems strange and far-fetched to us that a body of a man is thrown on Elijah's bones and springs to life. But is it so far-fetched? All of this should make us think about our proximity to loved ones who are dying or who have died. As they die and after they have died, power is released and received with touch as a loved one dies. We've become, as a culture, it seems, less comfortable with things like viewings and even memorial services, or even the presence of the body at any point in the dying process and in the burying process. And I would challenge us in that, to get a little more comfortable, to get a little more courageous in being present through the dying process, getting closer. You know, about every year I get to go up to Princeton, New Jersey, and visit my dad's grave. Sometimes I'm alone, sometimes I'm with my kids and my wife. I go up there a lot for continuing education. It's the seminary I went to study, to become a minister of word and sacrament. And he's buried in an old graveyard. It's a fascinating graveyard. But we always have had a ritual over these 13 years to bring Reese's Pieces with us. And we bring the Reese's Pieces. Dad loved Reese's Pieces in his life. And we take them and we scatter them all around the grave. We put them on top of the grave. I'm sure the folks who take care of the graveyard love us. It looks like a giant Easter basket around his grave. And inevitably, we eat some of the Reese's Pieces and laugh and are like, sorry, Dad, we really like these too. But we're celebrating you as we take a few before we scatter a few. And we always have a little silliness and laughter and remembering together. And we come to the grave a little down. But after scattering these, we leave the grave with a deep sense of thanksgiving and life and hope, that we knew Carl Walter Schafer, and that he gave gifts to us, and that he loved Reese's Pieces, and that this is all a part of the picture of life and death in the midst of the Alpha and the Omega. It's good to get to the physicalness of that grave and touch the grass and touch the stone and remember. The man who was thrown on Elisha's bones, through simple touch, sprung to life. Sometimes being around the dead springs us to life too. Don't avoid the dead in your life or the dying. To the contrary, lean in and touch, for you may find the gift of life. I don't think anyone would mind you having a Reese's Pieces on your way out. And all God's people shall say. Don't step on the ones I spilled either. Karen Melling may get mad at you. New carpet.